He thought slapping his pregnant wife in front of witnesses made him look powerful. He had no idea it had just handed a federal agent the last piece of a 2-year case. Some men mistake fear for respect. Claudio Navarro had been making that mistake his entire life, and on a cold Thursday evening in November, it finally cost him everything. The dining room of the Navarro estate was full that night. 12 men seated around a long cherry-wood table, capos, lieutenants, lawyers who knew better than to ask questions. Crystal glasses catching candlelight, the smell of braised short rib and expensive cologne thick in the air. A room full of power, or at least men who believed they had it. Vesper Holbrook Navarro stood near the kitchen doorway, one hand resting gently on the curve of her belly. 7 months along, she hadn't been asked to sit. She had learned early in this marriage that she was decoration in rooms like this, present but not seen, heard only when spoken to. She had also learned something else, how to be invisible while seeing everything. Claudio sat at the head of the table, holding court the way he always did, loud, certain, performing. He caught her eye from across the room and something shifted in his expression. A flicker. She had set the wrong wine glasses out. She knew it the moment she saw his jaw tighten. He didn't say a word. He stood up, crossed the room in 6 steps, and, without a breath of hesitation, struck her across the face with an open hand. The room went silent. Vesper did not fall. She steadied herself against the doorframe, one hand still protecting her belly, her cheek burning. She kept her eyes low. She had learned that, too. Old Claudio looked around the table slowly, that familiar half-smile on his face, the one that said, "This is what control looks like." Then he straightened his jacket, walked back to his chair, and picked up his fork. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. 3 chairs down on the left side of the table, a man named Reuben Holbrook, Vesper's older brother, reached slowly into his breast pocket, adjusted something small and rectangular, and set his hands flat and calm on the table. He didn't look at his sister. He didn't have to. The tiny recording device stitched into the lining of Vesper's cardigan had just captured everything. The sound of the strike, the silence that followed, Claudio's footsteps walking away, and 12 witnesses who said nothing. 2 years, 730 days of patience. Of Vesper whispering details into hidden mics. Of Reuben filing evidence under a case number so classified it didn't exist on paper. Of late-night phone calls where she asked how much longer and he said just a little more, V. Just hold on. Tonight, Reuben Holbrook, senior undercover agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation, sent a 3-word encrypted message to his supervising director from under the table. We have it. Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome back to the channel. Or if you're brand new here, we are so glad you found us. We tell stories here that will grab your heart and not let go. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. We love knowing our family is spread all across this great country. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it right now. Just tap the like button. It costs you nothing and it means the absolute world to us. Now, honey, get comfortable, because this story, it is just getting started. Moral woven in. The woman who looks the most put together is often the one holding the most pain together with bare hands. Vesper Holbrook had not always been a woman who stayed quiet. Growing up in Knoxville, Tennessee, she had been the girl who argued with teachers, defended strangers in parking lots, and once talked a landlord out of evicting an elderly neighbor just by standing on his porch long enough to make him uncomfortable. She was bold, she was warm, she had her mother's laugh and her father's stubbornness, and everyone who loved her knew it. That was before Claudio Navarro decided she was worth wanting. She met him at 26, at a charity gala in Nashville that her firm had catered. He was 41, silver at the temples, and he dressed like money looked effortless on him. He spoke to her like she was the only person in a room of 300. He asked about her job, genuine questions, follow-ups, the kind of attention that felt rare. He sent flowers the next morning to her office. Not roses, wildflowers. because he had asked what her favorite was and actually remembered. Vesper was smart, but even smart women can be worn down by a man who is patient and deliberate in his pursuit. What she didn't know then, what nobody in her life knew, was that Claudio Navarro ran the largest organized crime syndicate operating across 4 southeastern states. Extortion, money laundering, a web of corrupt officials so deep it had taken the FBI nearly a decade just to map its edges. Reuben knew. Reuben Eames Holbrook, 39 years old, 8 years undercover with the Bureau, had been tracking the Navarro organization long before his sister ever heard the name. When Vesper called him, glowing, telling him she'd met someone extraordinary, Reuben had gone very still on the other end of the phone. He ran the name that night. By morning, he was sitting in his supervising director's office with a decision that would rewrite the next 2 years of his life. He never told Vesper what he knew, not right away. He watched. He waited. He let Claudio court her, let the engagement happen, let the wedding come. A lavish, cold affair at a Savannah estate where Reuben stood as her only family and smiled through every moment with a federal badge burning against his ribs. 6 months into the marriage, Vesper called him crying for the first time. She didn't say what happened. She didn't have to. Reuben drove 4 hours through the night, sat across from her at her kitchen table, and told her everything. Who Claudio really was, what the Bureau had been building, and what he needed from her, if she was willing. "I won't force you," he said. "But V, you are the one person in that house he will never suspect." She had sat with it for 3 days. Then she called him back and said 4 words that changed everything. "Tell me what to do. Now. The key character you need to know. Della Foss." Vesper's housekeeper, 61 years old, sharp as a straight razor, and twice as dangerous. Della had worked in the Navarro house for 11 years before Vesper arrived. She knew every room, every habit, every dirty secret those walls held, and quietly, without ever being asked, Della had already been keeping notes of her own. She and Vesper recognized each other the first week, 2 women in the same cage, surviving the same storm, and never spoke about it directly. They didn't need to. Some alliances don't require words. They only require eyes that have seen the same things. Moral woven in. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding that what you're protecting matters more than how afraid you are. The first recording almost got Vesper killed. Not because she was careless. Because Claudio was paranoid in a way that most people only become after years of betraying others. He swept the house for listening devices every other Sunday, a habit so routine that even his men had stopped questioning it. He trusted no one completely, not his capos, not his lawyers, and not the politicians who took his money and smiled at his dinners. He had, however, stopped suspecting his wife a long time ago. That was his first mistake. It was a Wednesday in February, 14 months into the marriage, when Vesper activated the first device. A micro recorder no bigger than a coat button, stitched into the lining of a throw pillow in Claudio's private study. Reuben had mailed it to her inside a birthday card from a fake aunt, instructions written in a code they'd invented as children playing in their grandmother's backyard in Knoxville. She placed it on a Tuesday night while Claudio slept. Wednesday afternoon, his underboss, a thick-necked man named Fredo Camorra, 53, hands like sledgehammers, came to the house for a meeting that wasn't on any calendar. Vesper brought coffee to the study door, as she always did, knocked twice, set the tray on the side table in the hallway, and walked away. She heard enough through the door to know the recorder had caught something significant. What she didn't anticipate was Claudio calling her into the study 20 minutes after Fredo left. He was standing at the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Someone's been in here," he said. Not a question. Vesper kept her face the way she had been practicing. Soft, slightly confused, unbothered. "I dusted in here Monday," she said. "Della was with me the whole time." He turned and looked at her for a long moment. the kind of look that had no warmth in it anywhere. Then, "The pillow on the left chair is facing the wrong way." Vesper blinked. "Let one beat pass." Then she walked to the chair. He turned the pillow slightly, stepped back, and tilted her head the way a woman does when she's humoring a particular kind of man. "Better?" she said. He studied her face. She held perfectly still. Her heart beat loud enough, she was certain, to fill the entire room. Then Claudio looked away. "Don't let Della dust in here anymore," he said. "I'll handle this room myself." Vesper walked out of that study, closed the door behind her, went to the downstairs bathroom, ran the cold tap, and gripped the edge of the sink for 1 full minute. Then she straightened up, dried her hands, and sent Reuben a single coded text. "Pillow, works. Be careful." Reuben received it during a briefing in a federal field office in Atlanta. He excused himself, read the message in the hallway, and for the first time in a long career of controlled emotions, let out a breath that carried 2 years of tension in it. But that same night, something shifted. Claudio began watching Vesper differently. Not with suspicion exactly. More like a man who had remembered that the thing he thought was furniture was actually alive. He started asking where she was going, who she'd spoken to, why she'd been on the phone. Reuben's cover, as a low-level associate connected to a Navarro-adjacent business, had always kept him close enough to attend family gatherings without raising flags. But Claudio pulled him aside at a Sunday dinner 3 weeks later and asked casually how Reuben's import business was doing. Reuben smiled, answered every question, and spent the entire drive home running contingency plans in his head. Claudio wasn't sure yet, but he was starting to look. And in this world, starting to look was how people ended up at the bottom of a river. Vesper had made her choice. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was fighting. Quietly, carefully, with everything she had. "Ladies, are you still with us? Because, honey, we are just getting to the good part. Drop a comment and tell us. Are you Team Vesper? Because this woman right here is carrying a baby, carrying a secret, and carrying an entire federal case on her shoulders. She deserves every one of your prayers. Subscribe if you haven't. We are not letting this story go until justice is served." By month 18, Vesper had stopped counting bruises. Not because they stopped coming, but because she had trained herself to feel them as evidence rather than injury. Each one was a timestamp, a data point, and a piece of a case file growing thicker by the week inside a locked drawer in a federal field office in Atlanta. She documented everything. The recordings were the backbone. But Vesper had also been keeping a handwritten journal. Dates, times, exact words spoken, names of men who came and went, license plates she memorized from the upstairs window and texted to Reuben in grocery lists, disguised as shopping reminders. Need eggs, milk, GH, T, 4492. Bread, call plumber. Reuben had an entire wall in his off-site apartment covered in threads and timelines. The case was nearly complete. Nearly. But Claudio was tightening. It started with the phone. He began checking it. Casually at first, the way a man pretends he's just curious. Then openly. He scrolled through her messages while she sat across the breakfast table, and she learned to keep 2 phones, the visible one clean and ordinary. The second one, a prepaid burner Della had smuggled inside a hollowed-out candle, hidden behind a loose baseboard panel in the back of Vesper's closet. Then came the schedule. Claudio hired a personal driver for Vesper. For her safety, he said, patting her belly with a tenderness that turned her stomach. The driver's name was Ottone Facci, mid-30s, quiet and watchful. He reported to Claudio. Every trip, every stop, every minute she spent outside the house. Vesper adapted. She started asking Della to run certain errands. Della, who had 11 years of navigating this house, who knew which hallways had ears and which ones didn't, who had once looked Claudio dead in the eye when he spoke to her dismissively and smiled the smile of a woman who knew something he didn't. Della Fosse was not just a housekeeper. She was, it turned out, something far more. 3 weeks after Ottoni began driving Vesper, Reuben requested an emergency meet. They couldn't use the usual channel, a coffee shop 4 miles from the estate where Vesper occasionally shopped. Ottoni had started parking and waiting rather than staying with the car. Della arranged it. A dentist appointment, legitimate, scheduled weeks in advance. And while Vesper sat in the waiting room, Ottoni outside in the car, checking his phone, Della walked in through the back entrance with Reuben behind her, and then the three of them sat in a supply closet for 11 minutes. It was the first time Reuben had seen his sister face to face in 4 months. He looked at her. The way her shoulders sat differently now, the careful way she moved, the slight flinch when a door slammed in the hallway outside, and he had to look at the ceiling for a moment before he could speak. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Vesper looked at him steadily. "I'm holding," she said. "That's enough." He slid a new device across the shelf toward her, smaller than the last, sewn into the fabric of a cardigan, the one she'd be wearing the night everything came apart. "We're close, V," he said. 2, maybe 3 more months." She nodded, picked up the cardigan, folded it over her arm like it was nothing. Then Della leaned forward and said something neither of them expected. "There's a ledger," she said, voice barely above a breath, "in the floor of the wine cellar. Loose stone, 3rd row from the left wall. I've seen him go to it twice this year. I don't know what's in it, but he goes to it when he thinks the house is empty." Reuben stared at her. Della folded her hands in her lap and looked back at him with the patience of a woman who had been waiting a very long time to say something useful to the right person. "I've been in this house 11 years, Agent Holbrook," she said quietly. "You didn't think I just cooked and cleaned, did you?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing in that closet. Reuben reached into his jacket, pulled out a card with nothing printed on it but a phone number, and slid it across to Della. "We need to talk more," he said. Della tucked the card into her bra, stood up, smoothed her apron, and walked out like she was heading back to start dinner, which in fact she was. 2 women in that house, both invisible to the man who ran it. Both, quietly, taking him apart piece by piece. The truth has a way of surviving every attempt to bury it. You can pour concrete over it. It will still find a crack and grow. The ledger changed everything. Reuben had spent 2 years building a case around wire transfers, recorded conversations, and the testimonies of men who were too afraid to speak above a whisper. Solid evidence. Enough possibly to convict Claudio on 3 counts of racketeering and 2 of extortion. But the ledger. The ledger was something else entirely. It took Della 4 days to get to it safely. 4 days of watching Claudio's schedule, learning which evenings he left for his downtown office and which nights Ottoni drove him to meetings that didn't appear on any calendar. On the 5th night, when the house was as quiet as it ever got, Della went to the wine cellar alone. 3rd row from the left wall, loose stone. She photographed every page with the small camera Reuben had left with her. 47 pages, handwritten in a cramped, slanted script, columns of numbers and abbreviated names running margin to margin. She sent the files to Reuben at 2 in the morning. By 3, he was on the phone with his director. By 4, 3 additional federal agencies had been looped into the case. Because the ledger wasn't just Claudio's personal financial record, and it was a master account of payments made to 42 public officials across 5 states, judges, 2 state senators, a county sheriff, a deputy director of a regional law enforcement division whose name appeared 17 times with dollar amounts that made Reuben's director go completely silent on the phone for a full 10 seconds. This was no longer a regional organized crime case. This was systemic corruption at a scale the Bureau hadn't seen in over a decade. And somewhere in those 47 pages, buried in the abbreviations, was a name that made Reuben's blood go cold. R-E-M-S-H-L-K. His own cover identity. Reuben Eames Holbrook. Listed not as a target, not as law enforcement. Listed as a potential asset, with a payment notation beside it, dated 8 months ago, for $40,000. As someone inside the Bureau had sold his identity to Claudio Navarro. Reuben sat with that for exactly 4 minutes. Then he called a number known only to 3 people alive, identified himself with a code he had never used before, and said 6 words. "We have a leak. Go dark." Within the hour, the case was moved off the Bureau's internal server onto an air-gapped system accessible by 4 agents only. Every communication rerouted, every outside contact suspended, including his contact with Vesper. She didn't hear from him for 11 days. 11 days of silence while 7 months pregnant, living inside the house of a man who was beginning to look at her like a question he was very close to answering. Because Claudio had received something too. A phone call, anonymous, 3 sentences long. 3. This someone in your house is not who they say they are. The woman you married has been talking. You should check the cardigan she keeps at the back of the closet. Vesper didn't know about the call. She found out the way she found out most things in that house, by watching Claudio's face change at dinner. He had been looking at her all evening with something new in his expression. Not anger, not the flat coldness she had learned to read. Something more calculated, more still, like a man who was deciding timing. She excused herself after the meal, walked upstairs at her normal pace, closed the bedroom door, went straight to her closet, and found the baseboard panel ajar. The burner phone was gone. Vesper stood in that closet for 3 seconds. Then she walked to the bathroom, turned on the shower, sat on the edge of the tub fully clothed, and pressed both hands against her belly, feeling the baby move, slow and steady, unbothered by all of it. "I know," she whispered. "I know. We're going to be okay." She was saying it to the baby. She was also saying it to herself, because the cardigan, the one with the recorder, was not in the closet. She was wearing it, had been wearing it all through dinner. Whatever Claudio had been told, he hadn't found the device yet. But he was looking, and Reuben was dark. And she was alone in a house full of dangerous men with 47 pages of evidence sitting in a federal server and a baby pressing against her ribs like a reminder of everything worth surviving for. She had never been more afraid. She had never been more certain she would not stop. That when the ground falls out from under you and the people you counted on go quiet, that is not the end. That is the moment you find out what you are actually made of. Claudio moved on a Sunday. He always chose Sundays. Church in the morning, dinner in the early evening, the house settling into a false quiet by 8. It was the day he felt most like a legitimate man, and legitimate men, he believed, had the right to handle their households however they saw fit. He came to find her in the sitting room. Vesper was reading, or performing reading, which had become one of her finer skills. Her feet tucked beneath her, one hand resting on her belly, a lamp burning warm beside her. She heard his footsteps in the hallway and kept her eyes on the page. He sat down across from her, said nothing for a long moment. And then, "Who have you been talking to, Vesper?" She looked up, kept her face soft. "About what?" "Don't," he said. Just that one word, quiet and final as a door closing. She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something violent behind her ribs, but her hands, she had practiced this, her hands stayed still. "Claudio, I don't know what someone has told you, but—" He leaned forward. "I had your phone checked, the visible one and the one you think I don't know about. The burner. He had it analyzed. The texts were clean," he said. "Too clean. Grocery lists and weather updates and nothing else for 18 months. He tilted his head. "No woman talks that little. Not to her own brother." Vesper said nothing. "Reuben," Claudio said, letting the name sit between them like something with weight. "Tell me about Reuben." And there it was. She had prepared for this conversation in her head at least 200 times, had rehearsed every version of it lying awake at 3 in the morning while Claudio slept beside her. She knew what to say. She knew the exact tone, mildly wounded, confused, the particular brand of tired that a pregnant woman uses when she feels unfairly accused. She delivered it perfectly. "My brother barely calls me," she said, letting her voice go quiet and a little hurt. "You've made it clear you don't like him around, so he stays away. That's not suspicious, Claudio. That's him respecting your house." Something moved across his face. Not quite belief. Not quite doubt. He stood, looked down at her for a moment. "If I find out you've been disloyal to me," he said, "it won't matter what you're carrying." He left the room. Vesper waited until she heard his office door close down the hall. Then she pressed her face into the book in her lap and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of falling apart. Silent, controlled, her shoulders shaking once and then going still. 30 seconds. Then she straightened, stood up, and walked to the kitchen to find Della. Della took one look at her face and turned off the stove. They stood at the kitchen window together, not speaking, watching the dark garden. And Della pressed a folded piece of paper into Vesper's hand without looking at her. An address, a time, tomorrow, 10 a.m., written in Reuben's handwriting. He was back. But what Vesper didn't know, what Reuben had spent 11 days uncovering, was that the mole inside the bureau was not a low-level clerk or a compromised analyst. And it was Supervisory Agent Derek Wame, Reuben's own direct superior, the man who had approved every stage of the operation, who had access to every piece of evidence, every cover identity, every protected witness in the case. Wame had been on Claudio's payroll for 6 years. 6 years of feeding information, of steering investigations sideways, of ensuring that every time the Bureau got close to Navarro, something, a procedural error, a missing warrant, a witness who suddenly recanted, pulled them back. He had sold Reuben's identity the moment the ledger photographs were transmitted, had seen the file come through, and made a phone call within the hour. What Wame didn't know was that Reuben had gone dark fast enough, and what Claudio didn't know was that Wham, now cornered, facing federal charges of his own once Reuben surfaced the evidence, had made a decision in the middle of the night that men make when they finally understand there is no loyalty in the world they chose. He had flipped. Derek Wame, 6-year mole, was now the Bureau's most valuable cooperating witness. The case hadn't collapsed. It had just grown teeth. But none of that reached Vesper that Sunday night. She sat in her bedroom, baby moving steadily inside her, the cardigan folded on the chair across the room, the recorder still intact, still waiting, and she counted the hours until 10 o'clock the next morning. Outside, Ottone sat in the parked car at the end of the driveway. Inside, Claudio sat in his office with a glass of bourbon and a growing suspicion that something in his house had already slipped beyond his control. Yet he wasn't wrong. He just didn't know how far. There are moments when everything a person has built toward seems to dissolve all at once. Those are not moments of failure. They are the last defense a broken system throws up before it falls. The address Della had passed her led to a laundromat. Vesper almost smiled at that. Reuben had always loved the unremarkable, the places people looked straight through. A laundromat on a Monday morning, full of ordinary people folding ordinary lives, was exactly the kind of place a federal operation could breathe without being seen. She told Ottone she needed to pick up alterations from a seamstress 2 blocks away. Showed him the appointment card Della had prepared. A real business, a real address, and a favor called in through a network of quiet women who had been helping each other navigate dangerous men for longer than any federal agency had existed. Ottone waited with the car. Vesper walked into the laundromat at 10:02 a.m. Reuben was in the back, sitting at a folding table with 2 people she didn't recognize. A woman in her 40s with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have spent years in rooms where one wrong word ends everything, and a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses and a laptop that looked older than it had any right to be. Reuben stood the moment he saw her. He crossed the room in 4 steps and pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than either of them planned. She felt him exhale against her shoulder. The exhale of a man who had spent 11 days not knowing if his sister was safe and not being allowed to find out. "I'm okay," she said into his jacket. "The baby's okay." He pulled back and looked at her face the way older siblings do, reading every line of it, cataloging the damage, filing it somewhere private and painful. "Not much longer," he said. "I promise you, not much longer." He introduced the woman as Agent Corinne Sable, the new supervising agent on the case after Wayme's removal, brought in from a field office in Chicago, specifically because she had 0 prior connection to the Navarro investigation and therefore 0 chance of compromise. She shook Vesper's hand and held it a beat longer than necessary. "What you've done," Corinne said quietly, "is extraordinary. I want you to know that every person on this team understands what it has cost you." Vesper nodded once, didn't trust herself to speak. Then Reuben walked her through the full picture for the first time. The ledger, 47 pages, now fully decoded and cross-referenced against financial records subpoenaed from 3 banks. The recordings, 61 separate audio files spanning 22 months, documenting extortion, money laundering, conspiracy, and the direct ordering of 2 crimes serious enough to add federal felony charges that carried mandatory minimums. Claudio's best lawyer couldn't argue around. Wayme's full cooperation, a signed statement, corroborating evidence, and a willingness to testify that had the federal prosecutor's office moving faster than it had on any case in recent memory. And the cardigan, to the recording from the dinner, the slap, the silence. 12 witnesses doing nothing. "That recording," Corinne said, leaning forward, "is the piece that makes this case human. Numbers and ledgers convict organizations. What happened in that dining room convicts a man. A jury needs to see who Claudio Navarro is when he thinks no one is watching." Vesper reached into her bag and placed the cardigan on the table. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then the young man with the glasses, introduced only as Theo, the team's audio specialist, picked it up carefully, like it was something fragile and sacred, which in its own way it was. "This is clean?" he asked. "Everything he said," Vesper confirmed. "Every word, every second." Theo nodded slowly. "Then we have everything." It was Della, though, who delivered the final piece. 2 hours after Vesper returned home, Della appeared at the kitchen door with a basket of folded linens and slid a small envelope onto the counter without breaking stride. Inside was a single index card in Della's careful handwriting, a name, a date, a storage facility address 40 minutes outside the city. "He went there last Thursday," Della had written at the bottom. "Alone, 2 hours. I noted the mileage on Ottoni's car log. It matches." Reuben had the storage unit under federal surveillance within the hour. What they found inside: 3 fireproof cases of additional financial records, 2 burner phones with unencrypted call logs, and a passport under a name that wasn't Claudio Navarro, meant that even if he ran, there was nowhere to run to. The operation was set for Thursday night, the dinner, the capos, the witnesses, all of it. Exactly as it had already happened, because Reuben and Corinne had known about the dinner for 6 days, had let it proceed, had positioned 12 federal agents across a 2-mile radius, and wired the estate's exterior with surveillance equipment so precise it could read a license plate in the dark from 100 yards. They had waited for Claudio to give them one final, undeniable human moment of who he was. He had delivered it on schedule. Now Vesper sat in her bedroom, the house quiet around her, Claudio downstairs in his office unaware that the world he had built was already surrounded. She put both hands on her belly. "Almost," she whispered. "Just a little longer, sweet girl." The baby turned, slow and deliberate, like she understood. As Thursday came, the way significant days always do, looking exactly like every other day until it didn't. Vesper woke at 6, made breakfast, sat across the table from Claudio while he read the morning paper and drank his espresso and spoke briefly about a business call he had that afternoon. She nodded at the right moments, refilled his cup without being asked, smiled once when he made a comment about the weather. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. For just a moment, one unguarded, almost human moment, something crossed his face that might have been affection. Might have been the version of this marriage he had told himself existed when he needed to believe he was not simply a man who had acquired a woman and called it love. Vesper held the smile until he looked away. Then she carried the cups to the sink and stood with her back to him until she heard his chair push back and his footsteps leave the room. She exhaled, and then she went upstairs to get dressed for the dinner that would end his empire. By 7 that evening, the estate was full. 14 men this time. The usual faces plus 2 additional capos Claudio had summoned from out of state. Men whose presence alone told Ruben's team, monitoring from a surveillance van parked on a residential street 2 blocks away, that something significant was on Claudio's agenda tonight. A consolidation, perhaps. A promotion. An announcement about the organization's next chapter. Whatever he had planned, it would never be spoken. Corinne Sable sat in the van beside Ruben, headphones on, watching a grid of camera feeds on a laptop screen. And she had 12 agents in position, 4 at each exit of the estate, 2 on the roof of the property adjacent, 2 mobile units on the surrounding streets. Every exit covered, every variable accounted for. At 7:43 p.m., Ruben's earpiece clicked twice. Theo's voice from the audio station. Cardigan feed is live. We have clean audio. Ruben looked at the camera feed showing the dining room. Vesper, seated near the kitchen doorway where she always stood, one hand on her belly. Calm, steady, present. He pressed 2 fingers briefly to his lips. An old signal, something from childhood, their grandmother's kitchen in Knoxville. A private language between 2 kids who had grown up learning to communicate across crowded rooms. Vesper, looking at nothing in particular across the dining room, touched 2 fingers to her collarbone. Received. The dinner proceeded. Wine poured. Conversation ran. Business wrapped in social pleasantries, the particular dialect of men who conduct criminal enterprise as though it is simply commerce. Ruben's team recorded every word. At 8:17 p.m., Claudio stood to make what appeared to be a toast. Corinne straightened in her seat. Ruben said quietly into his mic, "All units, stand by." And then Claudio looked down the table, looked across the room at Vesper, and something in his expression shifted into the thing she had learned to dread most. That particular cold assessment. And before anyone moved or spoke, he crossed to where she stood and struck her across the face. The room recorded it in silence. 12 men. Nobody moved. Claudio smiled, adjusted his jacket, and turned back toward the table. "All units," Ruben said. "Move." What happened next took 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Federal agents entered through 3 simultaneous points: front entrance, rear garden door, and the side access used by household staff. They moved with the particular efficiency of people who had been planning this for 2 years and were not interested in drama, only in completion. The dining room doors came open at both ends at the same moment. 14 men at a dinner table looked up to find themselves surrounded by 12 federal agents in tactical gear, badges raised, voices controlled and precise. Claudio Navarro had exactly 4 seconds of standing still, his face cycling through disbelief, calculation, fury, and then something that might have been the first honest emotion he had shown in years, before Corinne Sable walked through the main door. He looked directly at him and said with the particular calm of a woman who had been waiting a long time to say it, "Claudio Navarro, Federal Bureau of Investigation, you are under arrest." He looked around the room, at his capos, already being separated, hands being secured. At the doors, all blocked. At the windows, agents visible in the garden beyond. Then he looked at Vesper. She was standing exactly where she had been, still, composed, both hands resting on her belly. She met his eyes, and for the first time in their marriage she did not look away first. Something moved across Claudio's face. The slow, terrible understanding of a man realizing not just that he had been caught, but how, and by whom, and for how long. The woman he had treated as furniture, the wife he had hit in front of witnesses and walked away from smiling, as she had been the architect of every single piece of this. He opened his mouth. "Don't," Vesper said quietly. Just that one word. Corinne stepped forward and Claudio Navarro, most feared man in 4 southeastern states, owner of judges and senators and a deputy federal director, put his hands behind his back without another word and was walked out of his own dining room. Fredo Camorra was arrested at the table. Ottone Facci was taken at the front gate. 2 of the out-of-state capos attempted to move toward the rear garden door and found 3 agents waiting with a patience that suggested they had been expecting exactly that. In the weeks that followed, the arrests spread outward like rings in water. 42 public officials, 2 state senators, a county sheriff who resigned before dawn the morning after and was arrested at the airport with a bag already packed. The deputy federal director was taken from his home on a Saturday morning in front of his neighbors, which the federal prosecutor's office had not planned but did not discourage. Derek Wame testified for 11 days. His account, combined with the ledger, the recordings, and the storage unit evidence, built a case so complete that Claudio's legal team, 4 of the most expensive defense attorneys in the Southeast, advised him within the first week to consider a plea. He refused. It took the jury 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Claudio Navarro was sentenced to 41 years in federal prison on a Tuesday morning in April, 9 months after the arrest. He was led from the courtroom without looking back. Vesper was not in the courtroom that day. She was in a hospital room 40 minutes away, holding her daughter for the first time. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, eyes the same deep brown as Reuben's, already looking at the world like she intended to understand all of it. Reuben was in the chair beside the bed when the verdict came through on his phone. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he set the phone face down on the side table, leaned forward, and held his sister's hand. Neither of them needed to say anything. Healing is not the absence of scars. It is the morning you wake up and realize the weight you have been carrying is finally, truly gone. And your hands are free to hold something beautiful instead. Spring came to Knoxville like it always had, unhurried, generous. It was the kind of season that doesn't announce itself so much as simply arrive. Dogwood blooming along the familiar streets, the air carrying that particular softness that belongs only to Tennessee in April. The city Vesper had grown up in, left behind, and spent 2 years quietly aching for. She had come home. Not running, not hiding, walking back through the front door of the life she had been born into, carrying a 7-week-old daughter on her chest in a pale yellow wrap, with 2 suitcases and a heart that was still tender in places but, for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, genuinely, quietly light. She named her daughter Wren. Small, watchful, built for open spaces. It suited her perfectly. The house Vesper moved into was 3 blocks from where she and Reuben had grown up, and a craftsman bungalow with a wide front porch and a garden that had gone wild and needed patient hands, which suited Vesper fine because she had patient hands and the time to use them now. And there was something deeply satisfying about coaxing living things back to order after spending 2 years surrounded by everything their opposite. Reuben helped her move in on a Saturday. He assembled furniture badly and refused to admit it, and Vesper laughed for the first time in what felt like years. Real laughter, unguarded, the kind that surprised her by arriving so easily. She stood in her kitchen that first evening, Wren asleep in a bassinet by the window, the garden catching the last of the day's light outside, and she felt the shape of her own life again. the outline of it. Like a room you've been away from long enough to see it clearly when you return. She put her hands flat on the counter and breathed. Just breathed. No recordings, no codes, no footsteps she needed to identify before she moved, no performance of a version of herself designed to survive rather than live. Just the kitchen, the light, the sleeping baby, the garden, hers. Della Foss retired 4 months after the arrests. The Bureau, in a quiet acknowledgement that would never appear in any press release, ensured that her retirement was comfortable, a detail Corinne Sable had personally insisted upon and Reuben had backed without hesitation. 11 years in that house. 11 years of watching and waiting and keeping notes in careful handwriting and knowing without anyone ever telling her, and that one day the right person would come along who needed what she had been gathering. She moved to her sister's place in coastal Georgia. Sent Vesper a card when Wren was born. A simple one. Pale blue, with 3 sentences inside. She has good eyes. She will know how to read a room. Raise her to trust what she sees. Vesper kept it on the kitchen windowsill. Corinne Sable was promoted to special agent in charge of the Southeastern Field Division, the youngest woman to hold the position in the office's history. She sent Vesper a single text the day the appointment was announced. None of this happens without you. I want you to know that. Vesper read it twice. Then she set the phone down, picked up her daughter, walked out to the front porch, and sat in the old wooden rocker she had found at an estate sale and repainted herself, a particular shade of green that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen, and watched the street for a while, ordinary life, moving at its ordinary pace. She had not understood before what a gift that was. Reuben closed the case officially on a Wednesday in June. He sat in Corinne's office and signed the final documentation, 40 pages of summaries and evidence logs and chain of custody confirmations. And when the last page was done, he set down the pen and looked out the window for a long moment. 22 months under cover. 2 years of carrying his sister's safety as a weight no professional training fully prepares a person for. Of sitting in rooms with Claudio Navarro and performing ease while understanding exactly what that man was capable of. Corinne slid an envelope across the desk. Inside was a letter of commendation and a transfer approval, a position he had quietly applied for 3 months earlier. Field instructor, Quantico, teaching the next generation of undercover agents the craft he had spent a career developing. He had decided, somewhere in those 11 days of silence, that the work he was most needed for now happened in classrooms rather than dining rooms. He drove to Knoxville that Friday evening. Vesper had made dinner, nothing fancy, the kind of meal their mother used to make on weeknights, simple and warm and exactly right. They sat at her kitchen table while Wren slept in the next room. And then they ate and talked and laughed about things that had nothing to do with federal cases or mafia organizations or any of the enormous, exhausting machinery of the last 2 years. At some point the conversation quieted and they just sat. 2 siblings in a kitchen in Knoxville, the window open, spring evening moving through the house like it owned the place. "How are you?" Reuben asked. The real question, the one underneath all the others. Vesper considered it honestly, the way she had relearned to do, without performance, without management, just the true answer. "I'm good," she said. And then, quieter, "I'm actually good, Rue." He nodded slowly. Outside, the dogwood was still blooming. Wren made a small sound from the next room, not distress, yet just the conversational murmuring of a baby discovering that she has a voice and the world will listen. And Vesper smiled before she even stood up. She brought her daughter back to the table, settled her against her chest. Wren looked up at Reuben with those serious brown eyes, and he leaned forward and said something soft and ridiculous in the voice people reserve for infants, and Vesper laughed again. That sound, easy, real, filling the kitchen, was the sound of a woman who had survived something enormous and come out the other side not diminished by it, but clarified. Who knew now with the particular certainty that only hard things teach, exactly who she was and what she was capable of and what she would never again allow anyone to take from her. She had walked through the darkest corridor imaginable, and she had walked out holding her daughter and her freedom and her own name, Vesper Holbrook, not Navarro, never again Navarro. And that was more than enough. That was everything. Final moral. The woman who endures is remarkable, but the woman who endures, documents, strategizes, protects her child, trusts her brother, and dismantles an empire from the inside, she is the reason we tell stories, so that every woman who feels alone in a dangerous place knows. Silence can be a weapon, patience can be a plan, and the ending is not written until you decide to write it yourself. Oh, sweet friends, we made it. We walked every single step of this journey with Vesper Holbrook, and we are coming out the other side with full hearts. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, please leave us a comment telling us your favorite moment. Was it Della in that closet? Was it Vesper holding Claudio's gaze at the arrest? Was it Reuben signing those last papers? Tell us. We read every single comment, and your words mean more than you know. If you are watching this and you are in a situation that feels impossible, please hear this. You are not alone, and silence can be a strategy, not a surrender. There are people who will stand beside you. Share this story with every strong woman you know. Subscribe to our channel because we have so many more stories coming. Stories about courage, justice, love, and the extraordinary things ordinary people are capable of when they decide that enough is enough. We will see you in the next one, honey.